Women's football has grown into a global force, celebrated by fans and recognised at the highest levels. But this isn't where the story began. Long before modern successes, women played the game through hardship, resistance, and war. They stepped onto the pitch despite restrictions, despite a world that told them football wasn't for them. Their battles weren't just about winning matches, they were about proving they belonged. Many of their stories have been forgotten, lost in history, but their contributions shaped the game we see today.
Women have played football for as long as football has been played, and that includes the pre-modern games. Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek artefacts show women taking part in ball games resembling football. And in the UK, there were games between teams of married and single women long before the FA codified football in 1863. But life was very different for women in 1914 compared to how it is today. Wealthier life expectancy was 55, but in the poorer East End of London, it was only 30. No women can vote, over half of men can. Over 5 million women have jobs, which equated to about a fifth of the female population aged 10 and over. And it's important to realise that women had been a sizable part of the workforce before the war. But these jobs were mainly in domestic service or the clothing and textile trades. A pint of beer costs 2p, and sport's popular. In 1 year, over 120,000 attended an FA Cup final. To compare this with today, Wembley's capacity is 90,000.
Then the First World War came along, the first truly global war. It was known at the time as the Great War. In the early days, people were swept up in war fever. Fearing what might happen if Germany won, men rushed to sign up, united by a sense of patriotism, duty, and the shock of war.
Ethel Bilbra, whose private papers are kept in IWM's archive, pasted the following in her war diary for 1914. Men and women of England, a ruthless and relentless foe seeks to grind under its heel your country and your liberty. You are called upon to light your lamps of sacrifice, to send every fit man to the front, your sons, your brothers, your friends, and to pray to God that they may return unharmed. In Britain, everyone was affected, whether they were fighting abroad or at home on the home front, and this included women. The overwhelming message was, your country needs you. Women went into the armed forces, in services such as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, into nursing, and they also took up volunteer roles, such as assisting with Belgian refugees on the home front, or creating comforts, such as knitting socks for the men away fighting. And they also went into munitions.
Asquith's new government created a Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George in May 1915. The ministry, rather than Kitchener's War Office, would now direct production of shells and guns. It built huge munitions factories and encouraged women to help fill the labour shortage by becoming munitionettes.
During the First World War, more than 900,000 women worked in munitions factories. Thousands of small businesses were converted to controlled establishments, which produced guns, fuses and shells. The majority of munitionettes, as they became known, were working class and had previously been employed as maids or in the textile industry. Not only did they get more pay in the munitions factories, the average weekly wage at the time was £1.40, whereas munitions workers during the war, by contrast, sometimes earned £4 or £5 or £6 a week, if they were male. But even women sometimes earned half this. But this was often for 12-hour shifts, sometimes with no tea breaks and an hour for lunch. But working in the factories also appealed to women on a patriotic level. Whilst their husbands, brothers and fathers were off fighting the war, these women felt a sense of duty to keep the country and the war effort moving. There were also other, less altruistic reasons for going into munitions. Aside from pay, working in the factories offered a new sense of freedom and opportunities away from the domestic sphere. They had canteens where the workers were served food, whereas women were much more used to being the ones serving it, and good, nourishing food at that.
Sometimes they'd have pickled herrings and all that sort of thing laid out for the worker to go and get a pickled herring, and the canteen here.
Some of the larger factories also built creches for children, enabling mothers to work there. So there was a real sense of camaraderie at work here, alongside the commonly held feeling that it was better than charring, better than doing housework or cleaning. It was a revelation for many, all reinforced by a shared sense that they were doing a valued and important job, however dirty or dangerous it may be. And it was heavy, dangerous work. Munitions factories were dangerous places. Major explosions happened in several of them. 73 workers were killed in a blast at a factory in London Silvertown on the 19th of January 1917. Chemicals and explosives sometimes caused lethal blood disorders and liver damage, turning skin yellow. So discoloured was their skin, in fact, that these women sometimes became known as canaries.
Everyone turned yellow there. And as you washed, so that yellow came off, but it's always in your system.
The Ministry of Munitions appointed a health committee to ensure all workers were looked after and therefore more productive. They had to ensure that output remained high. Alcohol was seen as the greatest threat to productivity. Lloyd George famously declared, "We are fighting Germans, Austrians and drink." And the British tradition of treating or buying rounds in the pub was banned. Employers encouraged workers to use their spare time profitably. The Church Army rest huts provided chapels, reading rooms and free writing paper. Without such activities, the employer's manual, The Health of the Munitions Worker, warned the public houses and less desirable places of entertainment may benefit, and women's football became popular.
Most factories employed a welfare officer to monitor the health, well-being and behaviour of their new female workforce. Sport, especially football, was encouraged, and many munitions factories developed their own ladies' football teams.
Women were able to demonstrate class allegiance. Many were working class, and perhaps they didn't want to learn dances or sing songs, whereas football appealed. Many of the women were wearing trousers in the factories anyway. In IWM London's First World War galleries, we have an example munitions uniform, worn by the female factory workers of the day. Such uniforms would have been very different attire for many. Women were used to wearing corsets, etc. The war meant that lots of women wore overalls and more comfortable clothes and even trousers sometimes for the very first time. So it was less of a leap into what some deemed an unfeminine kit. And the opportunity for fresh air appealed. The factories were filthy and dusty. Matches were played between teams from different factories and cup competitions were established. And perhaps given the ban on men's football, the FA had suspended official men's games at the end of 1914-15 season, publicity for the games was good. Women's football during the First World War period raised money for charitable causes, whereas men's football largely did not. They raised money for wounded soldiers, or those needing both physical and mental rehabilitation, such as those suffering from shell shock. And for this reason, playing football and supporting the matches was almost certainly seen as another kind of war work. It has been called something of a hidden story, but at the time it wasn't. Games featured heavily in the press at both a local and a national level. The game was popular, seen as modern and unifying, and also photographs have become less expensive to print. For the first time, publishers could illustrate articles with better and larger images, and football reporting lent itself well to this.
The term munitionettes began to be used in this period to describe women playing football matches, but it was a bit of a misnomer. It wasn't just munitions factories which raised teams.
Some teams had links with the military instead. The Lancashire United Transport Company, based in Atherton, had a team as early as 1915, and the women of the Preston Army Pay Corps had already played at Deepdale, the home of Preston North End Football Club, in 1916. And Lions tea rooms, of which there was famously one on every street corner at the time, and which were as well frequented as the most well-known of coffee shops today, raised several women's football teams. In total, it is estimated that there were around 150 teams of women playing football during the First World War. And these games attracted large crowds. Indeed, it was a matter for remark when only 1,500 spectators turned out for a visit of the Portsmouth ladies for their game with the Army Ordnance Depot in 1917. Southport Central, run by the Vulcan Motor Company, whilst it was given over to making munitions, now actually played under the name Southport Vulcan. Perhaps the earliest instance of sponsors requiring their name to be incorporated into that of the club. What had originally been looked on rather as a novelty was increasingly taken seriously.
football?
I played football with the White and Poppies girls, you know.
You didn't attract big crowds?
Oh no, there was good crowds going there, you know.
What position did you play?
Centre half.
Did you?
However, perhaps the most famous team, the Dick Kerr Ladies of Preston, had begun to play seriously in October 1917, based at the Strand Road Tram Building and Light Railway Works, originally founded by W.B. Kerr and John Kerr of Kilmarnock.
Dick Kerr's factory in Strand Road, Preston, saw employment at 8,000, of which 2,000 were women. The Dick Kerr's women's team originally started with friendlies being informally played between men and female workers at the factory. However, with the encouragement of both factory founders, they quickly grew into a formidable and accomplished side, playing games for charity to large crowds. The Dick Kerr Ladies played to a crowd of 10,000 people at Deepdale on Christmas Day 1917. They played against another munitions team from the Coulthard's factory, winning 4-0 and raising close to £500 for a local hospital. Their star player was Lily Parr, who was to go on to score well over 900 goals for the side in a career spanning 32 years. Lily Parr was something of a celebrity at the time, with reporters piling praise on her with accolades such as a 15-year-old girl who is said to kick like a First Division man, as reported by the Lincolnshire Echo in October 1920. A report in the Lancashire Daily Post in May 1924 ran with the headline, "The Champion Girl Footballer," and went on to say, Miss Lily Parr, outside left of Dick Kerr Ladies' team, who is regarded by the officials of the club as the cleverest girl footballer in the kingdom, has scored from outside left in 96 matches and scored 249 goals. She enjoyed widespread acclaim, and partly perhaps due to the fact that the footballers were paid expenses, became the first person in her family to own their own home. She was successful both on and off the pitch. After the war, she trained as a nurse, working at the Whittingham Hospital, a mental health faculty, while still playing football for the Preston Ladies. And close to 80 years later, she became the first woman admitted to the inaugural Hall of Fame at the English National Football Museum in Manchester in 2002. The team continued to play after the armistice, helping to raise money for injured servicemen and other causes. At the height of their popularity, they attracted a crowd of over 50,000 fans to Goodison Park, Liverpool on Boxing Day 1920. By 1921, the Daily Express reported that the Dick Kerr Ladies had, in the previous season, travelled 8,000 miles for matches, played in front of 1 million spectators and raised an enormous £48,000 for charity. A huge sum of money at the time. To compare, this would equate to a little over £2 million today.
However, women's football was not without its critics. For some, the novelty, the shock, even of a row of ladies' knees appearing in a press photograph must have been considerable to traditionalists still fussing about slowly rising skirt hemlines. And the fact that it was to prove so popular too was not universally well received.
Some of these concerns were addressed in an article published in Bombshell magazine in June 1917, which reported, "Machinery, it has been said, is the cuckoo that has ousted women from the nest of domesticity. Certainly, during the last few years, women have proved their mettle in almost every sphere of activity. Who, for instance, would have dreamt 2 years ago of women playing football? But the times change and we change with the times, and nowadays we regard with quite languid interest announcements of grand ladies' football matches and similar atrocities which would make our grandmothers turn in their graves if they knew of them. It is the opinion of some people that playing football destroys woman's chief charm, that elusive and indefinable quality which, for want of a better word, we call femininity. Women were also paid expenses for taking part. However, there had been unverified reports that too much had been absorbed in expenses by the players, who were profiting from the success of the game, which, fairly or unfairly, discredited the women's teams. The suggestion that it was unsuitable for women was mooted as another reason to ban the game, but it may have simply been that it was getting too popular. Some said more popular than the men's game, which had itself been reinstated following the end of the war and the return of the men from the front. Alfred Frankland, questioning these concerns, invited doctors to watch the Dick Kerr ladies play on Boxing Day 1921, when the suitability of the sport was deemed by one reporter as no more taxing than a day's heavy washing or work. However, this was not enough to sway the Football Association. The resolution was passed unanimously, and women were banned from playing football on associated, affiliated and league football grounds in December 1921. The Dick Kerr ladies, along with other teams, kept playing beyond the ban, but without access to FA grounds, they struggled. Nonetheless, they played several games in France to aid restoration funds for destroyed French towns, and they continued to play throughout the 1920s and 30s. However, despite a degree of civic support, without the ability to play on much more than recreation grounds and pitches, women's football was no longer able to reach anything like the audiences it had previously enjoyed.
Women's football remained a minority sport for over 50 years, with the Football Association only lifting the ban in England in 1969 and forming the first women's international side in 1972.
The First World War clearly expanded the worlds of both work and play to women, and this included the joy of playing football. And more than that, playing football well and to popular and widespread acclaim. These women were celebrities in their day, playing internationally, raising large sums of money for charity and enjoying the popularity they as players received, both on and off the pitch. Which brings me to my final point. If women's football was so well known about during the First World War, well supported and widely documented in the newspapers of the time, why has it all but disappeared, both from the narrative of the First World War and the history of sport in general? There are many reasons why this may have been the case. Perhaps the women were reluctant to talk about it. The men were coming home from the war having seen terrible things, so maybe they felt that their contribution was much less remarkable in comparison. Was there some guilt at the fact that whilst the war was being fought, they were having fun? Or did the expenses scandal perhaps shame them? One thing is certain. The fact that the FA banned the game in 1921 meant that the game was effectively rendered invisible. And so, despite the fact that women continued to play football beyond the ban, the fact that the FA did not endorse any of their matches means their games have not been included in any official records or history of the sport during the period. Happily, the outlook for women's football today is much more positive.
In today's world, Lily Parr would have been as famous, well-paid and decorated as England's Lucy Bronze. Parr and many other figures' resilience and determination to keep playing beyond the ban paved the way for the success of modern teams. The journey for equality in the sport continues to be long and hard, but there is no doubt that the women players of the First World War will be watching over the Lionesses proudly.